Jonathan Clements again, back to talk about all things Gunbuster, and here in episode 4 we have Toshiyuki Kubooko returning as lead animator after not being around since episode 1. And something that is switching around as well is the opening theme song, which is not here. In fact, there are no opening credits in this episode, and the opening theme is instead used to play us out in order to cram enough action and adventure into the allotted running time. There's also coming up, at the end of this episode, there's a next episode announcement which asserts that the next 2 episodes have only just been approved and they haven't got a script yet. And that's being a little bit economical with the truth, I think. It's certainly possible that the Gainax went into this production with the fear that they might be cancelled only part way, which is why this episode has a nice, rounded ending that could, at a pinch, be said to finish the story. But they certainly had a vague plan for 6 episodes from the very beginning, and I know this because I've read the original outline, and there are some interesting things in it. Firstly, it literally promises robot action and aim for the ace meets Top Gun, as well as a guarantee that there's going to be some sort of nudity or fan service in every episode. It also suggests that the combat will be framed as a sort of homage to the submarine manga of Satoru Ozawa, like Blue Submarine No. 6, for example, but with beam weapons and relativistic physics. So that's all there from the beginning. The leading lady's name was originally Marino Kurehara, and Big Sister was called Barako Ayase, Barako meaning Rose Child, and there are vestiges of that left behind in the addressing of her as Rose Queen by some of the characters in the finished anime. But the outline, as it was originally written, does get very vague by the later episodes. For this episode, for example, I can read you the entire synopsis in the original proposal, and it goes as follows. The giant robot, known as the Buster Machine, is a research project which Marino and Barako are chosen to pilot together. And that's it. It's fleshed out a little bit by the second draft, but not a whole lot. And as Noriko sprints along the travelator here, past young Freud, we get a tiny little moment for Linda Yamamoto, a character who does very little in Gunbuster except giggle a bit and then scream when she's killed. But we do know a little bit more about Linda from the peripheral materials, because she has been Jung's partner in crime ever since episode 2, when, if you may remember, she is the one who is said to have taken their homing beacons around the moon so that Jung and Big Sister can have a fight. It turns out that Linda is Swedish. Who knew? Everybody except me, apparently. Played by Ayako Shiraishi, who started off playing Patty in the anime of Little Women and the titular Gene Diver and Tensai Terebi-kun, and had a decade as a voice actress before suddenly and controversially quitting the business in 2002. And the reason that she gave in public interviews was that voice acting did not pay her enough money to eat, and that after giving it the good old college try, she was giving up and going home. So her departure, and it was a literal departure, she literally got on a plane and flew off home from the anime world. There was a bit of hand-wringing afterwards about something which should have been really obvious, which was that it was going to be difficult to earn your money just from voice acting, and that performers needed other strings to their bows, such as singing contracts or modelling or live action or whatever. Shiraishi concentrated solely on voice acting, it seems, and her departure left a number of productions in the lurch, including Pokemon, which had to find somebody new to play Joey after episode 246. And so, in something of a little step back in character development, young Freud is still up for anything that resembles a fight and has challenged Noriko to the space equivalent of a paintball match, but we're not going to see it because Noriko has been so traumatised by the loss of Smith that she is going to prove to be literally unable to go on. And this is a lovely evocation not only of the realities of post-traumatic stress disorder, but of the relative lack of interest taken in it by the World War II Japanese military. The state had spent 20 or 30 years grooming the younger generation for a glorious death in combat, and really was unprepared for the likelihood that the extreme stresses of the battlefield would come home to haunt it on the streets and in the bars and in the factories. The Japanese state in World War II, in fact, seemed to have very little concept of the need for soldiers to have some downtime to decompress, which historians have attributed in part to the gung-ho nature of Japanese militarism, but also to the fact that the Japanese military had very little direct battlefield experience in World War I, whereas the European powers all got to learn the hard way about the nature of shell shock and what we now call PTSD, unless soldiers got some time away from the theatre of battle. Coming up here as well, we're going to have a rather mannered catfight between Big Sister and young Freud over Jung's willingness to torment Noriko after she's been through so much. But when that scene comes along, do look behind Jung's head in that scene, because you'll be able to see a sign proclaiming that the 7th to the 13th of October 2022 is Space Radiation Sickness Education Week. Have you experienced symptoms of space radiation sickness? Is it worse than COVID-19, we wonder? Because I'm a sad fanboy, I actually marked the occasion over at my blog, and you'd be pleased to hear that none of my readers reported symptoms of space radiation sickness. So for those who were wondering what the date was, you saw it there on the wall, plain as day. Subjectively, at least for the characters on the Exelion, the events in this episode take place in October 2022. And the Gunbuster timeline, and of course the girls don't actually go home until 10 years later, thanks to time dilation. So the only other event on the Gunbuster timeline in this period is some sort of religious war that breaks out on Earth in 2030. But that's not mentioned in the series proper, and it's presumably something from the manga or the novels. But anyway, now we have Coach's absolutely fantastic cabin done up like some sort of samurai mansion, complete with a kotatsu with an inset star map monitor, go board, bonsai tree, and a no mask on the wall. And the calligraphy behind him, in the case the subtitles on this release don't cover it, reads kokoro, or heart. And we also have a little wind chime here that mystifyingly blows in the non-existent breeze. Perhaps Exelion has air conditioning that simulates outside air, as so many other elements of shipboard life seem to replicate earthbound conditions to make the passengers feel more at home. But this confrontation serves, yet again, to emphasise Coach's dogged and frankly unjustified faith in Noriko as a likely pilot candidate, and Kazumi's increasing frustration that he isn't listening when it comes to her likely partner on board the two-man Gunbuster. Remember, ever since episode 1, Coach has been favouring Noriko above more obvious candidates. Kashihara was the second-rated pilot of the school, but she'd literally been left behind on Earth. Young Freud was proclaimed, once again, literally as the genius girl pilot, but she's been sidelined. Kazumi herself is officially the best pilot in the fleet, but Coach has been training Noriko. And as Kazumi points out to him, this risks looking like a ridiculously convoluted and ultimately self-defeating quest for revenge, all born from the fact that it's Noriko's father who sacrificed his own life to get Coach into the last evacuation pod. As we discover in the novels, actually, Kazumi's father also sacrificed himself for Coach. But fans of the work of Haruhiko Mikimoto, by the way, should look out for a few cameos from Macross in Gunbuster. We've already had a girl in the locker room who looks suspiciously like Lin Minmei, and I suspect that some of the other background characters listening to the captain's announcement here may also be doppelgangers from other shows. Mikimoto is credited on Gunbuster with character initiation or advice or early draft, something like that. But he's not the official credited character designer. That is Toshiyuki Kubooka, who is also the lead animator on this episode and on episode 1. The captain's announcement also makes clear something that has not thus far, I think, been explicitly stated, which is that the monsters do not know where humanity has come from. Their reaction in the Perseus arm has been directed solely at human incursions, and so even if they may be streaming around the galaxy looking for humanity's place of origin, it's 12,000 light years away from the place of first contact, so that will be like looking for a needle in a haystack. And there's a certain fatalism in this approach, a sense that humanity cannot really head out among the stars at all, and is technically hidebound in the Sol system. It's something that crops up in Yukinobu Hoshino's 2001 Nights as well, the possibility that human beings simply cannot survive on other worlds, and that Earth is the sole cradle, and indeed coffin, of humanity. This, of course, is anathema to anyone who wants to write a space opera about the manifest destiny of humanity in the universe. So everybody usually likes to draw a discreet veil over that possibility, as it tends to only provide enough material for a downbeat short story rather than a novel or a TV show. Something to watch out for, by the way, at 10:43 in this, at the top of the screen. As everybody warps out, you will see the sight of the space cruiser Yamato entering warp alongside all the other vessels of the Earth fleet. For some reason, by the way, just then as the camera was tracking across the dormitory, Kazumi was reading a copy of No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. There are all sorts of complex contextual reasons why she should be. Dazai himself was liable to have been suffering from some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder when he wrote it, but it's also about a character who realises the degree to which artists process their trauma through their art. Something possibly of greater relevance to Gainax's later anime epic, Neon Genesis Evangelion. Now, much like the Minovsky particles that reduce space combat in the Gundam universe to one-on-one punch-ups, the fact that the monsters are attacking the Exelion in subspace means that radar doesn't work, and so with it, many of the long-range and guided missile attacks that might otherwise be expected to give humanity an advantage are also gone. But this whole thing has been designed in the story to give us the very situation that the captain was desperate to avoid, which is to say, the leading of the enemies of humanity directly to the solar system, thereby revealing its location. Which leaves us with this situation at the cliffhanger at the halfway point in this episode, with the Exelion and a dozen other ships being all that's made it out of subspace, surrounded by dozens of monster vessels just about to launch their own attack. And when it comes to the design of the alien vessels and the attitude towards these aliens, this, like the time dilation subplot, relies very heavily, I think, on Joe Haldeman's The Forever War, which, if you've never read it, remains one of the best science fiction novels ever written. And as in The Forever War, humanity is dealing with an alien threat, which initially it is entirely unable to communicate with, which means that everything is reduced to a military response. The origins of The Forever War have an interesting and rather fannish route to the page, in the sense that what we have is a science fiction fan, Joe Haldeman, who ends up getting drafted to serve in the Vietnam War, and he's sent away to an alien place where he fights an unknown enemy. And the character is a fan of Robert Heinlein. The original author was a fan of Robert Heinlein, books like Space Cadet and Starship Troopers, but he comes back from Vietnam having had a very different experience of war from his sci-fi reading. And Haldeman first tried to write up his experiences in a contemporary novel called War Year, but nobody was interested in it. I'm the very proud owner of a copy of War Year, which I bought at vast expense, second-hand. But it was something of a flop when it came out, because back then no one really wanted to hear about Vietnam, so he rewrote it as if it was a science fiction novel. And one of the things he added was the idea that every time the soldiers returned from a tour of duty, time dilation meant that conditions on Earth had changed radically, because literally decades had gone past. So you get this baffled traveller who goes away for what he thinks is a subjective week, and comes home to find that everybody he knew was dead, and there have been huge societal changes, and so he re-enlists, which just makes everything worse. Coming up, we've got a launch scene, by the way, where the camera tracks around the discarded magazines in the girls' dormitory, and one of them is called Bishonentai, or Pretty Boy Squad, an anime waiting to happen if ever there was one. So the captain is taking a gamble here, that taking out the lead monster might have a detrimental effect on the rest of the monster squadron and give the survivors of the human race a chance. Someone else who's taking a gamble is the hapless Linda, who thinks she's onto a winner by being sent out in Noriko's machine, but that basically means she's going to be taking Noriko's place in the upcoming defeat. Now, once the battle starts, it will be nice to see Jung Freud doing some damage, but even she's going to get outclassed by the monsters. Her hairstyle, incidentally, is not all that coincidentally similar to the hairstyle of Haman Khan from Zeta Gundam and from Double Zeta Gundam. Gundam, of course, has a huge influence on any creator in the Japanese animation field, either as an inspiration or as something to push against. And in many ways, I think Gunbuster have done both with Gunbuster. Gainax have done both with Gunbuster and ultimately with Evangelion. So many years ago, I think it was 2009, I was on a panel in Switzerland with Yoshiyuki Tomino, the creator of Gundam, and with 3 or 4 very high-ranking members of Gainax. And it turned into one of those car crashes that convention organisers try to avoid. Because the thing is that creators of that magnitude and that rank are rarely asked to share the limelight with one another and rarely have any truly common ground to share. And it didn't help that the organisers of the film festival were following a sort of cornflake packet rendition of history that insisted on referring to Gainax as the Gainax boys. I kept on hearing Gainax ragazzi hissing from the Italian earphones next to me. So this is a reasonable narrative in some regards. Gainax themselves often pushed the idea that sci-fi in Japan in the 1980s was some sort of ossified establishment into which anime fans like them had pushed, finding themselves unwelcome, but ultimately taking over and steering the conversation in the following decades and becoming, in a way, the new establishment. So, I mean, that's all fair, and that's a fair comment, right? But the way things were drifting in this event, the narrative was becoming one of anime being an ossified establishment, which Gainax was rescuing from itself. And of course, you've got the notoriously prickly Tomino sitting there as the conversation continually implies that Gundam was somehow old-fashioned and the Gainax boys are here to rescue the genre. And eventually, he grabbed the microphone, he snatched it away, and he said, in English, "I am also otaku." In other words, he'd been there in 1981 at that launch event for the Gundam movie, literally proclaiming a new century, proclaiming a new era for grown-up anime. And now these little punks were showing up like it had all been their idea. And Gainax didn't like it either, because Takami Okai was one of the people there, and he said, "I've been a company director for 20 years. Now, why do you keep on talking about me like I'm some kind of teenager?" So they were hardly boys at all. Even when they made Gunbuster, they had the incredible achievement of the Wings of Oniamis feature film behind them, which should have surely locked them into the anime world as accomplished professionals. In some ways, they were hoisted by their own petard, since they continued to present themselves to the world as the fans' fans. I think Gainax did profit to a degree from that sort of attitude among fandom. So I just want to tell you another story, actually, while we're digressing, about something that happened to me last year when I was interviewing Mamoru Hosoda about his feature film, Bell. And I said there was a certain iconic quality to the image at the beginning of that film of his titular pop star standing on the back of a giant whale singing a song, and I asked him if perhaps it had been a reference to the ending of Macross, Do You Remember Love, which has an idol singer standing at the prow of a spaceship singing at attacking aliens. And he said, no, that's not what inspired that shot at all. And he said to me, "Jonathan, I wonder if you've ever heard of an anime called Gunbuster, because there's this scene in Gunbuster where the robot comes out and stands with its arms folded on the front of that ship, and that's such a fantastic moment in anime, and that's what I was trying to evoke with Bell on the back of that whale." And Mamoru Hosoda and I are very similar in age. We were both impressionable students when Gunbuster was released in 1988 and 1989, and he said that Gunbuster was a show he very much enjoyed when he was young and starting out in animation, and it's clearly something that left an impression on him for him to be tipping his hat to it 32 years later. One also gets a sense with overseas fans of Gunbuster that even though Gunbuster derives so much of its material and weight from references to earlier shows, many of these references are unseen by its viewers, who don't see the resonances or the in-jokes. So Gunbuster rising out of the ship with its arms folded has become an iconic moment in anime history. It's called the Buster pose or the Gaina stance, and it's referenced repeatedly in subsequent Gainax anime, but it doesn't originate here. In fact, it, along with many other elements of Gunbuster, is a homage to Getter Robo and the appearance of the G-Dragon robot. But to know that, you'd probably have to have been a 13-year-old Japanese boy in 1974, which I'm not sure any of us actually were. And if you were, you probably don't need me here telling you this. As for Gunbuster's attacks in this episode, they too are homages to old anime and tokusatsu shows, special effects shows, mainly from the 1970s. Gunbuster itself is a design combo, deriving largely from Getter Robo and Space Runaway Ideon, while the Buster Beam is a mixture of the Getter Beam from Getter Robo and the Imerium Beam from Ultra 7. But wait, there is more. The Buster Collider, for example, is a homage to the Mach Collider from Super Robot Mac Baron, and that was a show that was made in 1974. All when Hideaki Anno in particular, but also the rest of Gainax, were very impressionable young teenage boys. And of course, owing to the fact that Gunbuster isn't completed yet, we have this time limit on the battles, which derives in part from Ultraman. Brad Warner, who used to work at Tsuburaya, once told me that Tsuburaya came up with that device not only for dramatic tension, but because it locked them into a limited amount of special effects battle footage per episode. So that's a lovely little touch, this draining battery timer, which of course Gainax would use to full dramatic effect later on in Neon Genesis Evangelion. I can't help you with inertial canceller though. I'm not sure whether it was something invented for Gunbuster, although subsequently it is referenced in lots of robot action from Wild Arms to Infinite Stratos. So I don't know if that's like a Gunbuster thing or something from the real world that just happens to sound cool. There is of course mention of inertial dampening in Star Trek, so it may just be a general sci-fi trope. However, we will have some things to say about Gunbuster and Star Trek in the coming episodes. So, Noriko is impaled on the end of the big tie-in at the front of that monster, like Ming the Merciless at the end of Flash Gordon. But Coach is pleased, because just like his ultimate inspiration for the character of Coach Munakata in Aim for the Ace, he is the one person who believed in the lead's potential, and now he has been vindicated. Although those of you who know the story of Aim for the Ace will also know that Coach Munakata has some additional drama coming up later in his life, as does Coach Ota in Gunbuster. Which is where we came in on this episode with a sort of mini-climax as the aliens retreat. And as I noticed at the beginning, when episode 5 goes from there and how it escalates, it appears to be something that Gainax hadn't given that much thought to at the time that they completed this episode. So here I have the original proposal for episode 5, and once again it's so short I can read it to you in its entirety. The monsters fight with the Buster machine. The girls find out the truth of the monsters for the first time, and an alien fleet heads towards Earth from the centre of the galaxy. And what I find fun about that is that pretty much all of that has been used up in terms of story beats in this episode. So maybe that's what they mean when they say, oh god, now we have to pull something out of a hat really quickly. So, how are they going to do that? How will our heroes, the makers of Gunbuster, actually come up with a story for episode 5 when they've already used up their synopsis for episode 5 and episode 4? Tune in next episode for some shocking homecoming revelations, space combat that goes up to 11, and a sudden tragedy that will come as no surprise whatsoever to anyone who has read Aim for the Ace. No flipping now. No flipping.
Say, say, say. きなり企画が決まってしまって、まだ脚本も上がってないの。嘘みたいな本当の話。ああ、神様、のりこはどうしたらいいの？次回タイトルだけは決まっているトップを狙え第5話お願い愛の時間を、そして最終話果てしなき流れの果てに稲妻キーク。